The old floorboards creaked underfoot as I slowly made my way down the dark hallway. The house had always made strange noises, but tonight they seemed louder, more ominous somehow. I paused, straining to hear any other sounds over the pounding of my own heart. Silence. Letting out a shaky breath, I continued towards the bathroom, my socked feet padding softly. As I reached for the doorknob, a sudden chill ran down my spine. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt the distinct sensation of being watched. Whirling around, I scanned the shadowy hallway, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, turning back to the bathroom. I flipped on the light switch, the fluorescent bulb flickering to life. My reflection stared back at me, eyes wide and face pale. I splashed some cold water on my face, trying to calm my nerves. "It's just the old house settling," I told myself. "There's no one here but me." I dried my face and stepped back out into the hallway, making my way towards the kitchen. As I passed the guest bedroom, a movement in the corner of my eye made me pause. Peering into the darkened room, I thought I saw the curtains sway, as if someone had just brushed past them. Heart pounding, I flipped on the light, but the room was empty, the curtains still. Shaking my head, I continued on to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I opened the fridge, grabbing a bottle of water. As I took a sip, a loud crash from the living room made me jump, water sloshing down the front of my shirt. What the? Cautiously, I made my way to the living room, dreading what I might find. The large framed painting that had been hanging on the wall now lay shattered on the floor, the glass scattered across the hardwood. I stared at it, confused. There was no way it could have fallen on its own. It had been securely mounted. Heart pounding, I began to carefully pick up the shards of glass, my hands trembling. As I swept the debris into a dustpan, I froze, my blood turning to ice. The painting was now back on the wall, perfectly intact. I stumbled backwards, the dustpan clattering to the floor. This wasn't possible. I distinctly remembered the painting being on the ground, broken. Quickly, I scanned the room, looking for any other changes, but everything else appeared untouched. Okay. Stay calm," I muttered, running a hand through my hair. There has to be a reasonable explanation for this. Forcing myself to take a deep breath, I headed back to the kitchen, intent on calling a friend or relative to come stay with me. As I rounded the corner, I nearly jumped out of my skin. The kitchen table, which had been clear just moments ago, was now covered in an array of objects: my car keys, a half-empty glass of water, and a small figurine that I distinctly remembered keeping on the mantel in the living room. I stared at the items, dumbfounded. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered, my voice shaking. Suddenly, the glass of water tipped over on its own, the liquid spilling across the table. I let out a strangled cry, stumbling backwards. As I watched in horror, the figurine began to slide across the table, as if an invisible hand was pushing it. It came to a stop directly in front of me, staring up with empty eyes. That's when I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound. Footsteps. In the hallway. My heart pounding, I slowly turned towards the sound, every muscle in my body tense. At first I saw nothing, the hallway shrouded in darkness. Then, a flicker of movement, a slight distortion in the air. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, it materialized before me. A figure, hazy and indistinct, like a mirage shimmering in the desert heat. I stared at it, transfixed, as it slowly took on a more solid form. It was a woman, her features blurred and indistinct, as if I was looking at her through a foggy window. She was dressed in a tattered white gown, her long dark hair cascading down her back. Her eyes were sunken, her skin an unhealthy pallor. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. We stood there, frozen, staring at each other. Then, she began to move, gliding effortlessly across the kitchen floor towards me. I tried to back away, but found myself rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. As she drew closer, I caught a glimpse of her face. Her eyes were empty, devoid of any humanity. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt a sense of dread wash over me. This was no ordinary intruder. She reached out a skeletal hand towards me, her fingers brushing my arm. I flinched at her icy touch, a strangled cry escaping my lips. In that moment, a flood of memories came rushing back, memories I had long since buried, forgotten. The car accident, the hospital, the endless days and nights spent by her bedside, praying for a miracle that never came. And then, the funeral, the tears, the crushing grief that threatened to consume me. I had tried so hard to move on, to put it all behind me, but now it was all rushing back, the pain as fresh and raw as the day it had happened. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real. You're not real." But she was, and as she drew closer, I could see the truth in her eyes. This was no ghost, no figment of my imagination. This was her, the woman I had loved and lost, standing before me once more. How I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. She opened her mouth, as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she reached into the folds of her tattered gown and pulled out a small, velvet-covered box. Holding it out to me, she let it drop from her fingers, the box clattering to the floor at my feet. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling. As I opened the lid, a sob caught in my throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft velvet, was the engagement ring I had given her all those years ago. "This can't be happening," I murmured, tears streaming down my face. You're gone, and I trailed off, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. I had tried to move on, to build a new life without her. But deep down, a part of me had always held on to the hope that somehow, some way, she would come back to me. And now, here she was, standing before me, as real and tangible as the ring in my hand. I looked up at her, my vision blurred by tears, and in that moment, I knew what I had to do. Slowly, I slid the ring onto my finger, the familiar weight of it comforting and familiar. As I did so, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips, and I knew that she understood. This was my answer, my silent promise to her. I reached out, my hand trembling, and gently brushed her cheek. Her skin was cold, almost icy to the touch, but in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was that she was here, with me, just as she had always been. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words catching in my throat. "I'm so sorry. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day, and I never will." She nodded, her eyes shining with a newfound light. And in that moment, I knew that everything was going to be all right. Together, we turned and walked out of the kitchen, the strange events of the evening now forgotten. As we made our way down the hallway, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, a weight lifted from my shoulders. Whatever the future held, I knew that I would face it with her by my side. And as we stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder and excitement. After all these years, she was back, and this time, she was here to stay. We walked hand in hand, our footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. I couldn't take my eyes off her, marveling at how real and tangible she felt. It was as if no time had passed at all, and we were simply picking up where we had left off. As we reached the end of the driveway, she turned to me, her eyes shining with a newfound clarity. "Where do we go from here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I paused, considering her question. It was a valid one after all. So much had changed in the years since her passing. I had built a life for myself, one that, while fulfilling, had always felt like it was missing something. And now, with her back by my side, I knew that missing piece had been found. "Anywhere," I replied, squeezing her hand. "Anywhere you want to go, we'll go. Together." A smile spread across her face, and in that moment I knew that this was right. This was where we were meant to be side by side, facing the world head on, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Without another word, we set off down the road, our steps in sync, our hearts beating as one. The night air was crisp and cool, the stars twinkling overhead like a million tiny beacons guiding us forward. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew that with her by my side, I could face anything. The pain, the grief, the uncertainty had all faded away, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. As we walked, I couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The accident, the heartbreak, the years of longing and loneliness, it had all led us here, to this second chance, this opportunity to start anew. And in that moment, I knew that I wouldn't trade it for anything. Because in the end, it was all worth it, just to have her back in my life, to feel the warmth of her hand in mine, to see the love and adoration shining in her eyes. We walked on, the night stretching out before us, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with a new chapter of our story. And as we went, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and anticipation, because I knew that no matter what lay ahead, we would face it together, side by side, as we always had. So we walked, our footsteps echoing in the silence, our hearts full of hope and the promise of a future that was ours to write. And as the first rays of dawn began to peek over the horizon, I knew that this was only the beginning. In the small town of Darkville, many secrets were hidden. Old houses, covered in cobwebs, seemed to harbor the spirits of the past. It was here, in one of such houses, that strange and inexplicable events were taking place. A young man named Jack moved to this town, hoping to start a new life. He rented an old mansion on the outskirts of town, unaware of the secrets his new abode held. After the first night in his new home, Jack felt that something was off. The heavy shadow of the past hung in the air, as if urging him to pay attention to something important. Every night he heard strange noises, footsteps echoing through the corridors, knocks on the walls. One night, waking up from a knock, Jack decisively made his way to the old attic. There, in the darkness, he saw the silhouette of a woman. Her eyes gleamed in the darkness, and her ghostly lips whispered something inexplicable. Jack began his investigation, trying to unravel the mystery of this house. He studied old archives, talked to the locals, but couldn't understand anything. All his efforts seemed in vain, until he stumbled upon an old recording in the basement. The recording told the story of a gruesome crime that occurred in this house many years ago. A young woman was murdered by her husband, who then took his own life. Their souls remained wandering the corridors, seeking redemption. One day, when Jack decided to conduct a seance to contact the spirits, he unexpectedly encountered the powerful energy of the past. The spirits asked him to help them find peace, to unravel the mystery of their deaths. Jack agreed to help, driven by the desire to solve the mystery and help these souls find peace. But with every step towards the truth, the dark forces of the past resisted, trying to keep them forever trapped. In the end, after numerous trials and dangerous events, Jack uncovered the secret of the past. He learned the true story of the family that lived in this house and found a way to help the souls find peace. Fighting against the darkness and his own fears, he managed to lead these souls to their long-awaited redemption. Now their home was no longer a place of fear and horror, but a symbol of hope and renewal. After completing his journey into the past, Jack left Darkville, but his soul remained in that house. He realized that everyone could face the darkness of the past, but it was important to remain strong and determined in the fight against it. And so ended the tale of a small town with big secrets and of a young man who dared to defy them. Even if victory turned out to be his departure, his feet would remain in the memory of this town forever. It was a quiet evening at home, just like any other. I was sitting in the living room, lost in thought, when I heard my mother's voice calling me from the kitchen. My heart skipped a beat as I froze in place. My mother had passed away 5 years ago, yet her voice sounded so vivid, so real. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that gripped me as I cautiously made my way to the kitchen. The voice grew louder, more urgent, echoing through the empty halls of the house. My mind raced with memories of my dear mother, her warm smile and comforting presence. As I entered the kitchen, a cold shiver ran down my spine. There, standing in the dim light, was the figure of my mother. But her eyes were empty, devoid of life, and her voice was nothing more than a haunting whisper. "Run, he's in the house," she urged, her words sending a chill through my bones. Panic surged through me as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I turned to flee, but a sinister presence lurked in the shadows, blocking my escape. I could feel its malevolent gaze upon me, its presence suffocating, as if it had been waiting for me all along. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I bolted for the front door, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to get as far away from that house as possible. But no matter how fast I ran, the darkness seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with its icy grip. As I stumbled out into the cold night air, I realized the horrifying truth. The voice that had called out to me, the figure in the kitchen, it was all a ruse, a twisted game played by the malevolent entity that now haunted my home. And as I turned to look back at the house, I knew that I would never be safe again. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was something evil in that house, something that had been waiting for me to return, biding its time until it could claim me as its own. Chapter 8. The Final Stand. Determined to rid myself of the sinister presence that had taken hold of my home, I gathered my courage and returned, armed with holy water and prayers of protection. But as I stepped through the threshold, I knew that this would be my final stand, my last chance to free myself from the darkness that had consumed me. In the end, as I faced off against the malevolent entity that lurked within the shadows, I knew that I had no chance of survival. But even as darkness closed in around me, I refused to give in to fear. For in that moment, I realized that true courage lies not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to face it head-on, no matter the cost. As my screams echoed through the empty halls of the house, I knew that I had lost the battle against the darkness that had consumed me. But as my consciousness faded into the void, I took solace in the knowledge that I had faced my greatest fear and emerged stronger for it. And as the house stood silent once more, the malevolent entity that had haunted its halls for so long reveled in its victory, knowing that it had claimed yet another soul for its own. Kevin jolted awake in the dead of night, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he lay still, listening intently to the silence that enveloped the room. Then he heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere nearby. At first, Kevin dismissed the sound as nothing more than the wind rattling the windows. But as the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. With a sense of growing unease, he turned his attention to the window. As Kevin approached the window, his breath caught in his throat. The tapping wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within the room. Panic surged through him as he realized that the sound was echoing off the glass of the mirror that hung on the opposite wall. With trembling hands, Kevin edged closer to the mirror, his reflection looming large in the dim light of the room. He watched in horror as his own reflection seemed to move of its own accord, tapping against the glass with long, gnarled fingers. As Kevin stared into the depths of the mirror, he felt a cold chill run down his spine. There was something deeply unsettling about the way his reflection seemed to mimic his every move, as if it were a separate entity trapped behind the glass. Just as Kevin was about to turn away, he saw something move in the darkness behind him, a shadowy figure lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. With a sinking feeling in his gut, he realized that he was not alone in the room. Heart pounding, Kevin whirled around to confront the intruder, but the room was empty save for the eerie silence that hung in the air. Fear gnawed at his insides as he searched every corner of the room, but there was no sign of the shadowy figure that had seemed so real just moments before. As Kevin stood alone in the darkness, a sense of dread washed over him. He knew that he was not imagining things, that there was something malevolent lurking within the mirror, something that had been waiting for him to let his guard down before making its presence known. In the end, as Kevin's reflection continued to tap against the glass with its twisted fingers, he knew that there was only one way to escape the horror that had consumed him. With a shaking hand, he reached out and smashed the mirror into 1,000 pieces, hoping against hope that it would be enough to banish the darkness that lurked within. But as the shards of glass lay scattered on the floor, Kevin realized that the nightmare was far from over. For in the fractured pieces of the mirror, he could still see his own reflection staring back at him, its eyes filled with a cold, unyielding malice. And as the darkness closed in around him, he knew that he was trapped in a nightmare from which there would be no escape.